Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Constantinople 674 to 678 and Marj Rahit 684 Muslim expansion by Kings and Generals. So this is the next episode in Kings and Generals early Muslim expansion series. Last time we witnessed some pretty crazy events. The death of Ali, the end of the first Muslim civil war, and the rise of Muawiyah to the position of caliph. There's been a lot of turmoil in the Muslim world lately, a lot of conflict. Perhaps we'll finally see some stability now that we have a new guy in charge. I don't know, I guess we'll have to see. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
In the last two parts of the early Islamic expansion, a previously united movement began to fragment, with the seemingly unstoppable conquests of the Caliphate halted by outbreaks of internal conflict.
That's true. I mean, one of the reasons that the early Caliphate was so successful in its conquest of the lands around it was the unity that Islam provided. I mean, we talked about how before the emergence of Islam, the region was a bunch of different Arab tribes, often feuding with each other. Then, Muhammad emerges, Islam starts to spread, and it really unites the entire region, all of these warring Arab tribes, into one very impressive military force. And then they expand, conquering a bunch of different kingdoms, eating into the Byzantine Empire, defeating the Sassanids, really seeing this amazing success. But over the last two parts, we finally saw some turmoil. We saw some civil war. I think that has stabilized at least a bit, though I'm curious to see how that affects the expansion of the Caliphate. I mean, obviously I know, as do all of you, that the Caliphate will continue to expand over a long period of time. But I'm curious if it will continue to expand as fast, or if there's going to be more political or civil tension that will disrupt that expansion. Clearly things have changed at least a bit.
Today, we return to our focus on the frontiers, in particular the North African holdings of the Byzantine Empire, as old conflicts reignite under the new Umayyad Caliphate, while the heirs of Rome struggle with internal conflicts of their own. Expanding just as rapidly as the Caliphate is our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends.
Alright, brilliant. So you guys know the deal. Please go and check out this video from Kings and Generals, which is linked in my description. Please go and give them a like, subscribe to their channel, and check out their sponsor. Basically, show them some support for making such fantastic content.
In the game. During the early years of the Umayyad Caliphate, the reigning emperor in Constantinople was Constans II, who faced an increasingly dire situation on numerous fronts. In 655, he had commanded the fleet that met disaster at the Battle of the Masts, only narrowly escaping with his own life.
Yeah, a pretty important moment for the early Caliphate, given as they had been a land empire, and this was some of their early forays into naval warfare, and already they were seeing successes over the far more experienced Byzantines.
Uthman's murder and the beginnings of the first Fitna the following year might have seemed like an opportunity for Constans to avenge his previous defeats against a divided foe. But Constance's attention was primarily turned to the west, where the Slavs and Lombards threatened Byzantine holdings in Greece and southern Italy. Not only did these European threats prevent him from taking advantage of the Islamic Civil War, but they also necessitated a rise in taxes in provinces such as Sicily and North Africa.
Not good. Your people are not going to be happy about that. I mean, look, we talked about before how internal division can lead to conquest by your enemies, particularly your neighbors. Though usually we've been talking about the Sassanids or the Romans, but now this is applying to the Caliphate. The Caliphate is now a big, important empire in its own right, and so it's having some of those same internal squabbles that makes it vulnerable. Fortunately, the Eastern Roman Empire is seemingly always dealing with some sort of chaos or internal strife. Particularly in this era, they're not having a good time. As you can see, they do still hold a decent amount of land in the West. They've held for a bit we had Justinian expanding back westwards, but, they're slowly losing that territory over time, and it becomes sort of harder and harder to defend some of that far-flung territory that used to be a part of the United Roman Empire.
And seizures of church assets in Italy, sparking discontent and resentment towards Constans among both the provincial populations and the court in Constantinople.
Yeah, I mean, and if you think about, how vulnerable the empire is at this point, how weakened their armies have become from, a few hundred years ago, how weakened their political system has become, constantly with all this political strife and drama, and how disconnected they are from their western provinces in the Italian peninsula and North Africa. I mean, you can even see it on this map. It's not surprising that the Byzantines would have a really hard time defending some of those western provinces, and they've already lost a lot of them to foreign enemies like the Lombards or the Muslims. Now, a lot of their North African and their territory in the Levant has been taken by the Caliphate. So they're sort of losing all this territory over a long span of time that they just cannot control anymore.
This political turmoil was worsened by another sort of conflict in the capital, a growing religious schism dating back to the reign of Heraclius. Efforts to reconcile differences between the Armenian and Greek orthodoxies led to the creation of the Monothelite movement. A sort of religious compromise followed, which failed to sway the majority of the Byzantine populace.
Yeah, we see this many times throughout Byzantine history, but throughout Christian history in general. You have, say, two different sects who believe different things, though honestly sometimes they're not that different. They have one minor theological difference, and the emperor might try to take the middle position, and it usually ends up pissing everybody off. With such an important thing as religion, as faith, people are not willing to compromise, at least most people, because they truly believe. Now, the emperor is usually seeing this as a political issue, and so he wants to compromise, bring everybody together, but it usually doesn't work out like that.
By Constance's reign, this movement, that had been intended to reconcile Armenian and Greek religious divides, had simply created new divides within the capital, with Constance's attempt to quell the schism by banning all discussion of the controversy, even forcing Pope Martin I into exile after his condemnation of monothelitism, only creating new enemies for the embattled emperor. In 663, 2 years after the end of the First Fitna and the renewal of Arab attacks into Anatolia, Constans abandoned Constantinople and its hostile court and moved the Byzantine capital to Syracuse in Sicily.
Wow.
Unfortunately,
that is quite the move, huh? I mean, that is... I guess perhaps he wanted to reorient westwards, sort of shift the focus of the empire back west, as it had been hundreds of years ago. But it's kind of a crazy thing because, the empire in general, and in particular the Eastern Roman Empire, which is, the surviving half, has been centered around Constantinople for such a long time.
The move would not long forestall his downfall. After relocating the capital, Constans moved into Italy with all the forces the empire could muster, in hopes of defeating the Lombards and securing southern Italy. His efforts were foiled at every turn, however, with the Lombards defeating him in a series of battles and forcing him to withdraw in shame back to Syracuse, while his son and co-emperor Constantine IV kept order in Constantinople. His legitimacy tarnished, he was unable to prevent Armenia from falling back into Arab suzerainty, and despite its prominence as the seat of the Byzantine Empire, Sicily would suffer a devastating naval raid in 666, led by Abdallah ibn Qais, that saw huge amounts of plunder enriching Muawiyah in Damascus.
Look at that, the Muslims are really getting out into the sea now. They're able to do seemingly pretty large-scale naval raids, and the Byzantines, perhaps because Constans has sort of split his power base, the Byzantines are unable to defend themselves.
Caliph Muawiyah, a veteran of the Battle of the Masts himself, and a staunch enemy of the Byzantines, was now making increasingly aggressive moves at sea with his expanded navy, with similar raids carried out on roads, while Arab fleets secured naval bases along Asia Minor's Mediterranean coast in preparation for a planned siege of Constantinople.
See, now this is becoming seriously threatening to the integrity of the Byzantine Empire. They've already lost a lot of territory, particularly territory on the periphery, to enemies, including the Caliphate. Now, the Muslims are raiding up and down the coast of Anatolia, getting increasingly closer to Constantinople. If one thing was basically true throughout the Byzantine Empire's history, it was that, Constantinople was the most important city. It was always centered around Constantinople. I mean, Constance is trying to shift west. It's not going to work. The empire will continue to be centered around Constantinople, and as long as they can hold on to that, the Romans survive. The Eastern Roman Empire still lives. Of course, eventually the Ottomans will take it, but we've got about 800 years before that happens. So you can kind of see the aims of the Caliphate. They're starting to sort of gun for Constantinople, the Eternal City.
Even among Constance's own subjects, he faced danger at every turn, and in 667 he was forced to contend with an Umayyad-backed rebellion by the turncoat Armenian general and would-be emperor Saborios that briefly took control of much of Anatolia. The rebellion would soon come to naught after Saborios' accidental death in a riding mishap shortly before battle near Melitene. But this would not be the end of Constance's woes, as Fadala ibn Ubayd, an experienced Muslim general who had briefly operated as a liaison and ally to Saborios, soon laid siege to Constantinople's Anatolian suburb of Chalcedon. Although they succeeded in capturing many prisoners, a lack of supplies and support caused this first siege attempt to flounder. In their original plan, they would have been operating in territory under the sway of their rebel ally, able to rely on local supply routes and bolstered by Saborios' own forces. Forced to operate alone in hostile territory, disease and hunger soon set in, and the army was forced to withdraw, with even the arrival of reinforcements under Muawiyah's son Yazid failing to turn the tide. It does appear that the initial Arab intention was to return to besiege Constantinople proper the following year, as a sizable garrison, 5,000 according to Theophanes the Confessor, was left behind in the captured fortress of Amorion to provide a forward base for a later attack. However,
and I mean, that is kind of crazy how deep into Anatolia they've gotten. I mean, I remember talking about earlier in the series when we were seeing Muslim raids in eastern Anatolia, how, wow, they're kind of getting into the Roman heartland at this point. Being stationed so deep into Anatolia, or even along the coast of Anatolia, I mean, the Muslims are threatening the Roman heartland. They're in the Roman heartland at this point. So, like I said, this is sort of a big danger for the survival of the empire, though, if you want to make it less catastrophic, like I said, if Constantinople survives, the Byzantines are okay. And Constantinople is basically impenetrable. I mean, it takes until the 1400s for it to be conquered. So it's an almost impenetrable city. So, if your belief is in that city, which if you're Byzantine, it should be, because that's how important it is, then you still believe the empire can survive.
Amorion would be recaptured during the bitterly cold winter that followed, with a eunuch chamberlain named Andrew leading a force through the heavy snows that regained control of the fortress and put its garrison to the sword, delaying the planned attack on Constantinople and denying the Arabs their first major inland foothold in western Anatolia. This small victory was to be Constance's last, however, with the emperor not long outliving his
It seems like it's, frankly, one of his few victories.
would-be usurper. Constans II was struck on the head with a bucket and assassinated by one of his servants as he
What the hell? Struck on the head with a bucket? Man, that is quite a way to go. I almost feel bad for the poor guy, honestly. He didn't have a super successful career, and he was taken out by being whacked with a bucket. Yikes.
took his bath early in 668, with further rebellion breaking out in Sicily as the conspirators in his murder acclaimed General Mazisius their emperor in opposition to Constantine IV. the young Constantine would thus be forced to confront both the rebels in Sicily and the still looming Arab attack on Constantinople in the first years of his solo reign. Of these two challenges, the rebellion of Mezesius would be the swiftest dealt with, though it would still leave the empire weakened in ways that would soon cause further disaster. Constantine called up troops from the embattled frontiers of North Africa and Italy, bringing an end to the rebellion in Sicily after 7 months and ending its brief heyday as the empire's capital. With Constance's murder and Mezesius's acclamation so closely tied to the ongoing religious schism, the general failed to command widespread support in Sicily beyond the soldiers under his command or rally supporters beyond the island's shores. By the account of Theophanes the Confessor, even Mezesius himself had not wished to become emperor and had been chosen as a figurehead leader against his will on account of his good looks. But how
Well, that is quite a way to select an emperor based on how handsome the guy is. And I will say, there were a lot of people who got caught up in situations like that. It was a big thing for the army, or a particular army, to acclaim an emperor, imperator. And they would just choose whoever their favorite was. And sometimes that guy did not want to be made emperor, but it got to the point where he didn't really have a choice. You have this whole army that wants to make you emperor. If you say no, they're basically going to threaten you into doing it. So I don't know what the particular situation was with that guy, but I'm just saying it happened many times.
However easily the rebellion might have been suppressed, the recalling of soldiers from North Africa did leave the Byzantine forces in Carthage far less able to resist the pressure of the Arabs in Tripoli, creating an opportunity for the conquest of the Maghreb, stalled since before the First Fitna, to resume. 668 and 669 saw renewed Arab raids capture many thousands of prisoners from the remaining Byzantine territories in modern Tunisia, as the uneasy stalemate the two sides and their respective Berber allies had settled into broke down, with the continuing Arab presence in Anatolia further distracting the overstretched Byzantines from the defense of their frontier provinces. Meanwhile, despite Muawiyah's western focus and enmity towards the Byzantines, smaller conquests still continued apace along the former frontiers of the Sassanid Empire.
Yeah, this is very interesting to me because just like how Muawiyah is more focused on Rome, so am I. I know a lot more about the Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, whatever you want to call it, than I do the East. I'm somewhat familiar with the Sassanid Empire, but this is at the eastern frontier of even the Sassanids, So this is an area that I have virtually no knowledge of, particularly at this time in history. So I'm very curious to see, what's going on.
In 670, Muhalab ibn Abi Sufra conquered Kabul and took at least nominal control of all of Khorasan, one of the only regions formerly under Persian domination to have remained outside of Arab control. And despite some staunch resistance from Turkic hill tribes that nearly saw one force surrounded and wiped out during its return to Kabul, he also successfully penetrated the Khyber Pass to begin the first inland conquests into modern Pakistan, previous Muslim incursions into the Indian subcontinent having been limited to the more easily traversed coastal lowlands. Politically, some unrest.
Yeah, the whole area is connected by land, but, when we're talking about, like, the Near East or the Middle Eastern world, or whatever you want to call it, you sort of focus on, this general area. We've got Anatolia, Asia Minor, the Romans, the Persians, the Arabs. Once we get to the Indian subcontinent, we're sort of entering into a new region. This is sort of a whole different side of history. They've got their own shit going on, different groups of people, different diplomatic relations, different, just a lot of new history that, like I said, I'm unfamiliar with, but there is still a connection, primarily through the Persians or whatever Persian Empire existed at that moment. Of course, now there is no Persian Empire, it's just all the Caliphate, and the Caliphate stretches, all the way from North Africa through to basically the edge of the Indian subcontinent. So that, that's quite the reach.
Still continued to flare up, as Muawiyah attempted to crack down on lingering support for Ali, with the respected general Hujr ibn Adi and several of his compatriots being executed for refusing to denounce the deceased caliph, an act shocking to most. Still, the next major prize for the largely unified caliphate and the single-minded focus that would define Muawiyah's later years as caliph was Constantinople, with the campaign to take it beginning in earnest in 672. A massive Umayyad fleet was outfitted and launched, wintering in the naval bases prepared in Smyrna and Cilicia, while the Byzantines hurriedly constructed great biremes and dromons for the city's defense.
Now we could see some Greek fire there, one of the most famous weapons of the Byzantines, the ancient Greeks, that apparently we still don't understand today. We still don't really know how it worked, but it seems to have been very effective and quite an intimidating weapon. I mean, just spewing flames at your enemies. So, very curious.
Equipped with a new and deadly anti-ship weapon, Greek fire.
Ah, there we go.
With the coming of spring, the fleet embarked for Constantinople, clashing almost daily with Byzantine ships in the waters just south of the Dardanelles from April until September. Compared to the Battle of the Masts, which saw the Arab fleet score victory in a pitched battle between two massed fleets, the presence of Greek fire would have made any full fleet-on-fleet engagement near suicidal for the Arabs, despite the greater size of their navy, leaving it infeasible for the Umayyad fleet to attempt to break through the Dardanelles or bring its full force to bear against Constantinople. Under the command of Yazid, Umayyad armies were ferried to land to surround the city, but a lack of...
There we go, now they're there on land nearby Constantinople. We're talking about the heartland of the empire before. Now, the Muslim forces are truly at the heart of the empire.
Effective naval support made overcoming the city's formidable defenses a truly daunting task. Though Arab forces under Yazid, Fadala, and Abdallah...
And here's what I will say about the Siege of Constantinople. I don't know too much about this event. What I do know is that in modern historiography, there's been some questioning of the accuracy of these events and whether such a siege really happened or such a siege happened how we know it. I know that our source for this is primarily Theophanes, who wrote a long time afterwards, at least decades, if not 100 years afterwards. And some modern historians have called these events into question. I really don't have an opinion on this because I'm not an expert on this. I don't know near to anywhere close enough to have an informed take. I just know that there is some controversy over the accuracy of this particular Siege of Constantinople.
Ibn Qais did see success in various skirmishes in the surrounding region and in Crete, and were able to honor the passing of the venerable commander Abu Ayyub al-Ansari by pushing to the Theodosian walls themselves to bury him at their base. For 5 full years, the campaigning of the Umayyads failed to break through the Dardanelles and cut off Constantinople from supplies.
Can't get past those Theodosian walls. Like I said, they are virtually impenetrable, and it'll take another 800 years. Though, Constantinople was sacked by the Crusaders at one point, but it wasn't taken for another 800 years.
While the Greek fire-equipped ships inflicted mounting casualties with every engagement. Finally, 10 years into Constantine's tumultuous reign in 678, flagging morale and a large rebellion of Mardaite Christians and escaped slaves in the Nur mountain range north of Alexandretta forced Muawiyah to abandon the campaign, the greatest military disaster the seemingly unstoppable caliphate had suffered since it had first exploded onto the world stage some 4 decades prior.
Yeah, that's a pretty big failure, but to be fair, I feel like the goal that was selected was kind of unachievable. The goal to conquer Constantinople, I can't really see that happening at this point. And so sure, it's a failure that they couldn't achieve that, but, I really couldn't have seen them achieving it anyway, to be honest.
Yet the successful defense did little to change the overall balance of power, with the struggling Roman...
Yeah, it's not like this is a massive loss for the caliphate. Both empires are still, in exactly the same position that they were. So I don't really think this has changed very much.
Still on the defensive against the still expanding Arabs. The following years would give a much needed, if brief, reprieve to the Byzantines, as Caliph Muawiyah's death in 680 was swiftly followed by a new period of turmoil and...
God, I feel like Muawiyah was here and gone so quickly. But he had a pretty damn big influence on the empire, on the caliphate, and was seemingly quite skilled militarily. But there you go, he's already gone.
Civil war. At the center of the new conflict was Muawiyah's attempt to secure the succession of his son Yazid, when caliphs had been chosen by election prior to his reign. Yazid was indeed acclaimed as caliph in Medina.
So Muawiyah wants a more dynastic system. He just wants to appoint his son and have it be that. But of course, what we've had so far, I've talked about this in prior videos, they didn't use a dynastic system up until this point to select the caliph. They used a council to appoint the next caliph. So Muawiyah wants to change that, as powerful men often do. Of course, that would breed a lot of controversy.
But when the governors and notables of the caliphate were summoned to give him their oaths of allegiance, two important figures refused to swear the oath: Hussein ibn Ali, son of Caliph Ali, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr, son of the Zubayr who had opposed Ali at the Battle of the Camel some 24 years prior.
Wow.
Despite the rivalry of their fathers, the two men were united in their opposition to Yazid and fled from Medina to Mecca to raise a rebellion against him. Offers of...
Interesting, they put the beef aside. Their fathers had conflict, but not the sons. I suppose it has been a while at this point. We've seen many years go past, and they're now united against Yazid.
Support soon arrived from Ali's former power base of Kufa, giving Hussein hope his murdered father's cause could be revived. A cousin of Hussein's, Muslim ibn Aqil, was sent to Kufa ahead of Hussein and his party to determine the strength of their support in Kufa, and out of suspicion the offers might be a trap by Yazid or a local notable attempting to curry his favor. Upon his arrival, he found the offers of support genuine, and as many as 12,000 flocked to Muslim's side to pledge their loyalty to Hussein.
Okay.
Upon receiving this news, Hussein departed Mecca to join his cousin in Kufa, a journey he would never complete.
Ooh.
Despite his recent rocky succession to the throne, Caliph Yazid was determined to stamp out the rebellion before it could grow to challenge him.
Okay, well, let's see how it goes for him, because Ali was defeated and assassinated, so he did not manage to protect his throne. Will Yazid be able to? Now we're seeing more civil strife, civil war in the caliphate. Looks like that stability from Muawiyah was only a brief reprieve, and we're right back into the infighting. Maybe it'll go the same way, maybe it'll be different this time. Maybe Yazid will manage to defend his position. I honestly don't know.
And upon learning that Kufa's governor, Nu'man ibn Bashir, had chosen to remain neutral and allow Hussein's supporters to gather, swiftly took matters into his own hands. Nu'man was transferred to a different province, with Yazid's loyal supporter, Ubaydallah ibn Ziyad, replacing him and initiating a harsh crackdown on the growing rebel band, with Muslim ibn Aqil and several of its other leaders being murdered and the demoralized rebels being scattered under intense pressure from local military forces.
Okay, well, Yazid is taking decisive action. Yeah, he's not standing for this. He is immediately trying to squash this rebellion, seemingly, without much mercy. But if you truly want to get rid of a rebellion like this, you do have to be, fairly brutal, and it seems like that's how he's behaving.
By the time Hussein received word of this disaster, he was already near today's Rifai, far from the safety of Mecca, with only a few supporters around him in increasingly hostile territory.
Uh-oh.
Hussein might still have turned back and returned to Mecca at this point, but opinions among his supporters were divided, with some of his tribal supporters offering him sanctuary in the mountains of northern Najd, while many in his own family encouraged him to continue to Kufa and avenge his murdered cousin. Eventually, Hussein took the latter decision, and though many of his supporters deserted him, his march towards Kufa continued.
Okay, I mean, he's continued to move forward, but it does seem like Hussein is sort of losing more support over time. Not to mention that Yazid has already taken action to quash some of the rebels, so I feel like the rebel movement started fairly popular, and now, due to the actions of both Hussein and Yazid, has gotten smaller and smaller.
Soon, at the plains of Karbala, his tiny band of supporters was chased down by Ubaydallah's army.
Yeah, his tiny band of supporters is how they refer to it. So I think I was right in my assessment that the rebel forces have shrunk quite significantly.
Hussein requested to be allowed to return to Mecca, while Ubaydallah demanded Hussein surrender and pledge his loyalty to
Hussein, come on, man! You've made it this far, you decided to continue. You have to fight now. What, you gonna request to return to Mecca? It's too late. You put yourself in this position, it's too late, man.
Yazid. When Hussein refused, the Umayyad forces surrounded Hussein's party, cutting them off from the water to force their surrender. When this too failed, the surrounding army attacked on October 10th, 680, killing Hussein and his supporters in a hopelessly unequal struggle.
Okay, well, the last civil war was a lot more of a two-sided struggle than this one. Hussein got demolished basically instantly. Doesn't seem like he even... I mean, at the beginning, you couldn't really tell which way it was going to go, but as soon as the cogs started turning, Yazid took some action, and Hussein started making, divisive decisions, everything started to fall apart for the rebels, and Hussein really did not stand a chance.
The battle had been short, and its outcome little in doubt. But the killing of Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, would shock the Muslim world, with
that is a pretty big deal, though.
The date of the battle immortalized by Shia Muslims as a day of mourning and Karbala as a pilgrimage site.
Wow, that's fascinating. Once again, we are in 683 at this point, so, we are a couple of decades down, but it still hasn't been too long since Muhammad was still around. And so we do still have, at this point, some remaining living links to Muhammad. And the death of Hussein is sort of a reminder of that. That's going to be a really big deal to a lot of Muslims. Like I said, to Shia Muslims, that's a pilgrimage point today. That's more than a political or a military event. That is a straight-up religious event. So that's pretty fascinating, and I'm, always find it interesting to look at those links back to Muhammad, since, he's such an important figure, of course for Islam, but just for history in general during this period.
Galvanized by Hussein's martyrdom, major revolts led by Abdullah would arise in Mecca and Medina in the following years, with Yazid's experienced Syrian forces under Muslim Ibn Uqba inflicting defeats on the rebels, but failing to regain the loyalty of the populace. The siege and...
Okay, interesting. I wonder, maybe Yazid sort of shot himself in the foot by being too brutal, though the alternative could have been that he lost his position as caliph, so he's held on to that. He's just lost, quite a significant amount of support.
Bombardment of the holy city of Mecca itself in 683 only created further outrage, with Yazid dying the same year under unexplained circumstances.
Well, I guess it doesn't really matter. He didn't even live to see the end of all of the conflict and rebellion and discontent of the populace. And unexplained circumstances. Of course, everybody always thinks, could he have been assassinated? He could have been coincidence. I suppose we don't really know.
His son and successor, the sickly Muawiyah II, would rule only a few months before abdicating, leaving an empty throne and a caliphate divided once more.
Great. Yeah, Muawiyah's dynasty, really not that successful. To be honest, Yazid didn't live for very long, and, he defended his position, but perhaps a little too brutally, and then Muawiyah II has just abdicated. So, not really a super successful dynastic period.
In the second Fitna.
Oh.
The years to follow would see numerous figures claim the caliphate. In the Hejaz, Abdullah ibn Zubayr was acclaimed caliph, with a majority of the Muslim world initially backing him.
Wow.
Ubaydallah ibn Ziyad, the general who had martyred Hussein at Karbala, established a power base in Basra and briefly claimed the caliphate as well.
We really have left that first period of stability that we saw. Before the first civil war, We're seeing different families ruling the caliphate. Everyone's not united anymore. It's about, well, do a majority of families support this guy? We're seeing different claimants to the throne, a lot of conflict, civil wars, constant strife and infighting. Just like a normal empire. This is not rare, but, it does sort of, I suppose, point out that period of stability that we saw prior to the First Civil War was quite remarkable. And it shows you the unifying power that Islam had before politics and family ties and dynasties started getting tied into it all. And then, infighting arose, of course, as it always does.
But failed to win the same widespread support, and was soon driven from Basra by an uprising of Kharijites. And in Syria, the only region still loyal to the Umayyad dynasty, Muawiyah II was eventually succeeded by Marwan, Caliph Uthman's secretary and cousin, with Yazid's young but popular son Khalid being sidelined. Ubaydallah would return to Umayyad service after the failure of his own bid for power, seizing 8 million dirhams from Basra's treasury before he fled, and would lead Marwan's armies in the coming struggle.
Okay.
Marwan's first challenge in defeating the more popular Abdullah was to secure his hold over Syria against a powerful foe uncomfortably close to home, Dahak ibn Qais, the governor of Damascus province, who had loyally served Muawiyah during the first Fitna, even leading his infantry at Siffin, but had now defected to Abdullah in opposition to the Umayyads, bringing much of Syria with him. Marwan did have several major advantages, though some fighting broke out in the streets after Dahak and the young Umayyad prince, Khalid ibn Yazid, each delivered speeches in favor of their faction during the leading of prayers. The Umayyads retained control of the city of Damascus itself, and by extension, the vast treasury of the caliphate, allowing Marwan to win the loyalty of many local tribes through bribery.
There you go. When we're looking at civil infighting and strife like this, and we see this many times in the Byzantine Empire, many examples of this. Of course, military power is important. That is one of the ways that you can win a civil war, and perhaps the most important factor in winning a civil war. Along with, we've seen political support, relationships, but something we don't want to forget is just the power of good old cash money. You can buy off people. More often than not, you can buy neutrality. You can, use the treasury of the empire or the tax money or whatever it is and hold it up above people's heads and say, hey, look, we can give you a bit of a tax cut here. The caliph's not going to do that, but we can help you out. Like I said, we see this many times in the Byzantine Empire. This is a common feature in these kind of civil conflicts, civil wars.
Dahak also retained some degree of loyalty to the dynasty he'd served so long, even briefly returning to Umayyad service after negotiating with Khalid and Ubaydallah, making him...
And just one quick note on that, the reason we see it a lot is because, there's a lot of different local power brokers in these big empires because, particularly now, we've left the period where the Roman Empire was at its peak and had really centralized power to an impressive extent for the ancient world. These empires they struggle to administer centrally. They have to administer policy and collect taxes mainly through their representatives, governors, leaders of towns, power brokers, generals, and all of these subordinates, these civil and military servants. Of course, they all look out for their own interests first because, being a governor of a province, sure, it's a way to serve the empire. And I am talking about the caliphate here, but this also applies to many empires in this period. Sure, it's a way to serve the empire, but it's also a way to serve your own interests, build up your own power base, build up your wealth. And so in a situation like this, these individuals are going to be very open to taking bribes or threats. They're going to do whatever they feel is best for themselves and their family and their dynasty, right? We see a lot of this politicking on every single level because this is what this sort of bureaucracy, this very decentralized bureaucracy, is what is necessary to administer such a large empire in this time period. So, yeah, that's sort of a generally applicable rule of this era. And, that'll take a long time to change. I mean, there's a long time before we see real centralization of power. By a long time, I'm talking like 1,000 years from this point.
Him a rather reluctant and indecisive opponent, spurred on only by pressure from his overwhelmingly anti-Umayyad supporters in the Qaisi tribal confederation. Even so, Dahak and the Qaisi were able to amass a sizable army of 20,000 or more at Marj Rahit, at the edge of the desert to the east of Damascus, joined by supporters from across Syria. Marwan, on the advice of Ubaydallah, gathered his own loyalists from the Kalb Confederation and from the remnants of the once powerful Ghassanids and rode out to challenge him, with the two armies meeting on July 29th.
Wow, the Ghassanids, huh? We have not seen them pop up for a while.
684. With his own supporters numbering some 6,000, Marwan was outnumbered greatly by Dahak's forces.
Uh-oh.
Nevertheless, his infantry-heavy army was able to hold firm over the course of 19 days of raiding and skirmishing from Dahak's largely mounted force.
Okay.
Marwan's left was commanded by Ubaydallah, and his right by Amr ibn Sa'id, also known as Al-Ashdaq, an Umayyad clansman whose ambitions would lead him to attempt his own grab for the throne in the years following. Dahak gave command of his right to Zayd ibn Amr, with other notable commanders including Thawa ibn Man of the Banu Sulaym, on whose insistence Dahak had finally broken from the Umayyads. On August 18th, the fighting grew fiercer and the skirmishing gave way to charges and hand-to-hand combat. Despite coming from so many disparate groups, the morale and discipline of Marwan's forces won out, with his hard-pressed infantry weathering numerous disorganized attacks until a mighty champion from among the Kalb, named Zana ibn Abdallah,
once again the emergence of a mighty champion,
slew Dahak in the midst of a heated melee.
Damn.
Neither side at first realized the governor had fallen, with Zana throwing himself back into the fray, unaware of the victory he had won. But another soldier, marveling at the warrior's prowess, soon discovered Dahak's body and returned his head to Marwan. Despite still holding a numerical advantage, the Abdullah loyalists quickly dissolved after their leader's defeat.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you're gonna lose a lot of organization, morale. A lot of the people there might not even want to fight once their leader is gone. So even if you have the numerical advantage, you're probably not gonna keep fighting once, the main guy, your leader, has been murdered by your opponents. And look at that, we have a victory from Marwan. Pretty impressive. I was thinking as we were going through this, I do wish I knew a little more about the history of this period, because, they're listing off all these names, some of whom will continue to be relevant, and I really have no context for them. So I can't be like, oh, it's that guy, he'll do this in 20 years, or that guy. But of course, what I'm doing right now is learning more about this history, so, I'm trying to correct for that gap in my historical knowledge, but it would be kind of nice if I already had a more general knowledge of this period.
The cavalry of the various tribes under Dahak's banner melting away and returning home or swearing obedience to Marwan. Many battles still lay ahead for the Umayyads, even with Syria now firmly in their grasp. Most of the caliphate still recognized Abdullah as caliph, and as the second Fitna drew on, more factions and challenges would arise to complicate the struggle for the throne. But with his victory at Marj Rahit, Marwan had rescued his dynasty from the edge of total defeat.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how, just the caliphate is structured, geographically, in that if we look at it on a map, the center is around, this big desert, basically, that's rather underpopulated, and then we have several population centers, like the Mecca-Medina area. We've got Syria, where the Umayyads are centered. We've got Iraq. We've got the Alexandria and North Egypt region. So it's like this big desert, not many people area in the middle, and with all these population centers around. I feel like it definitely lends itself to these different families, different dynasties, sort of ruling different areas and gathering local power over time. Though, that's true for a lot of different geographical setups. It's just sort of what I was thinking looking at this map.
And with the armies of Syria and the treasury of the caliphate behind him, he now stood poised to reclaim the empire Yazid had lost. In our next episode on the early Muslim expansion, the Second Fitna will continue, while war returns to North Africa as the Byzantine Empire goes on the offensive. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely.
The Byzantines going on the offensive. That is quite a rare sight. In the 680s, the Byzantines have been on the defensive for a long time. All right, yeah, that was an interesting one. Seems like we're getting, more Civil War, more Fitna content. We continue the infighting amongst the Caliphate. Can everybody just get along? I'm joking, of course. This is, like I said, what always happens with big empires and big polities of this size. We're almost caught up to, the present day video in this series. We've got Second Civil War in the Caliphate. Then there's slavery in the early Caliphate, which isn't part of the series, but they have it in their playlist. Then we have Carthage raised again, and that is the most recent episode in this series. By the time we get there, they might have released another one, but pretty soon, over the next few weeks, we're going to catch up with the early Muslim expansion series. And of course, I'll continue it, but at that point, we just have to take it as it comes. I'll just have to wait until they release them, and then I can post my reactions. So yeah, I had a good time with this one. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.